organization in Washington, D.C. That seeks to advance the public interest in telecommunications and technology, law, and policy. I want to take a moment to thank both the National Rural Assembly, which is the parent of the Broadband Policy Group, the parent organization, and Public Knowledge for hosting and organizing this briefing today. I also want to thank Congressman Jared Huffman and his staff for all their support in helping us organize and set up and make this event possible. Thank you guys. And thanks to the Rural Assembly and Public Knowledge. Today we're going to talk about the technology transitions. And to launch our conversation, we're going to hear from 6 rural advocates about why this is an important issue that your offices should follow. But first, by show of hands, how many of you have heard about the technology transitions or know about the IP transition? I mean, you don't have to be shy. Okay, so we're not all novices here, right? Before I keep moving forward, we will be tweeting this briefing. So if you are an avid tweeter, please make sure to do hashtag tech transitions and hashtag rural. There's a little plug-in for our media. So it's good to hear that not everyone is a novice on tech transitions. Is anybody interested in explaining it? No? All right, well, I can introduce it briefly. So what you need to know is the way the phone works is changing. The telephone network that connects our country has traditionally used copper wires and TDM, which is time division multiplexing technology, to bring telephone service to your homes and to your businesses. How many of you still have a telephone line at home? All right, so there's about 10 of us that still have a telephone line at home. Well, with the arrival of new technologies, as you've noticed, Americans are now able to use cell phones and internet-connected devices to make phone calls from their homes. And this is something that telephone providers have noticed. They also have begun to transition from copper wires and TDM technology to wireless and fiber-built networks using Internet Protocol technology. So this change in the underlying technology of our telephone network is the process that we call the technology transitions. We're transitioning from the technologies that we've had to the technologies that we are now able to use. The transitions present us with the opportunity to improve communication services for all Americans, but they must be handled responsibly in order to ensure that a transition in technology is actually a true step for all, and that no one is left without a reliable, affordable way to communicate. The transition is of particular interest for rural Americans, and our speakers today will tell us how. But first, a few numbers. 97% of our country has access to a telephone line. That's almost ubiquitous telephone access in the entire country. And we've achieved this remarkable access thanks to universal service rules that have helped extend telephone lines throughout rural America. But even with this level of availability, millions of Americans still rely on programs like the Lifeline program to be able to afford telephone service in their home. Now, by contrast, 53% of rural areas do not have broadband access. That's 22 million Americans that do not have access to high-speed broadband service, which means that landline telephone service is still the most available, affordable, and reliable communication service throughout rural America. So as the telephone network evolves, we want to make sure that any transition in technology is a true step forward for all. The goal of our briefing is to educate policymakers about how the technology transitions impact rural residents, and encourage you and your bosses to reaffirm the fundamental values that have created our nearly ubiquitous communications network. And those values are service to all Americans, reliability, consumer protections, public safety, and competition. So that's the general frame of what we'll be talking today. And let's begin with our panel. First, we will hear about service availability from Jody Griffin, who is the Senior Staff Attorney on Public Knowledge and is one of our in-house resident technology transitions experts. and she is from rural northern New York. Then we'll hear from Mimi Pickering, an award-winning filmmaker and director of Apple Shop's Community Media Initiative in Whitesburg, Kentucky. Ms. Pickering has reported extensively on telephone deregulation at the state level and engaged in efforts to stop legislation that allows telephone carriers to retire telephone service in rural areas. Both Jody and Mimi will tell us about the mechanisms in place that at the federal and state levels to ensure that telephone service continues to be available during and after the technology transitions. So, Jody?
Sit down. Is this working? I can just speak very loudly. Yeah, it's on. All right. Test, test. Okay, that's working. All right, so I'm Jody. I'm from Public Knowledge. We have a great panel here who is not from DC, so I will try to keep my remarks brief because you can talk to me anytime, and these rural experts are really, I think, people you're probably here to hear. But just to give a framing in particular for the role of the federal government in the technology transitions, I'll say at the outset, just as a reminder, so the technology transitions, this is something that's already happening. We are in the middle of it right now, and that's a good thing. There are lots of opportunities in the technology transitions, and the point that Public Knowledge has made has been that what we really want is to encourage the transitions, but make sure that they happen responsibly and that nobody's left behind. Where a new technology like Internet Protocol offers opportunities for better services or new features, that's fantastic. And where new physical infrastructure is maybe more reliable or can support new services, that's great. But we also want to make sure that people who are relying on specific things in the network right now aren't going to get left behind in the transition if we don't think about it first. So along those lines, Public Knowledge has emphasized that we should take a values-based approach to the technology transitions. We pointed specifically to universal service, competition and interconnection, public safety, consumer protection, and network reliability. And those values kind of framed in a different way, but basically essentially the same values, were also supported unanimously, bipartisanly at the FCC in an order more than a year ago now that was putting out a framework for trials to test new technologies that carriers wanted to offer as the new basic service. So, as I said, we have those trials going on, but really the thing that is front and center now, and the provision of our law at the federal level that's kind of the key point for the tech transitions is Section 214 of the Communications Act. And I'm going to dive a little bit into the weeds here just so you know kind of how it is that the federal government is involved in this. So Section 214, in part, says if you're a phone carrier and you want to change your service or you want to stop offering it, you have to ask permission from the FCC first because people are relying on that service, and this is the service that we as a country all came together to support and make sure everybody had access to. And so if the phone company wants to back out, that is something that is a great public concern and needs to be addressed in a public docket first before they can do that. So we have that provision. The FCC will examine requests to withdraw telecommunications services by thinking about whether withdrawing that service would affect the public convenience and necessity. Basically, are consumers going to be harmed if somebody stops offering the service? This provision has been in the law for a long time. It was pretty obscure up until now. It would be maybe a carrier saying, I don't want to offer telegraph anymore because nobody wants telegraph, and the FCC would say, okay, that makes sense to me, and they would remove it. Or somebody would say, there are so many other providers who are offering the same service, nobody will miss us, and the FCC might say, all right, that makes sense, and give permission. It was so streamlined, and in fact is so streamlined, that the default is that if the FCC does not take it out of streamlined treatment in its procedures, the applications get granted if nobody objects. So it's always operated like this, but now that carriers are thinking about switching in large swaths of the country to new technologies that are still relatively untested, and in the areas where we have seen them, We've seen customers say, wait, this doesn't support my heart monitor, or it doesn't stay up during a power outage, or the call quality is much worse. Now the FCC is thinking we need to set out some guidelines so that everybody knows what exactly we're going to look at when we want to switch to new technology. So they have a proceeding going now, a notice of proposed rulemaking that they have not resolved yet, it's still pending. And consumers, competitive carriers, people who have been relying on the network and are looking for the same reliability, the same success in general that we've seen, have been advocating before the FCC on that topic. There's also other areas of law that are impacted, Section 201, 202, those can go to basic truth in billing issues when a carrier might switch their network and tell a consumer, you have to move to a bundle now, or you can't get a basic standalone voice service, which is not true. So the FCC looks into that and under other authorities too. But for the most part, it's Section 214 that is the big hook right now. And that is the provision where the FCC is going to look at these new technologies and say, are these really comparable to what we had before? And ideally, are they better? But at the very minimum, are we making sure that the people who are relying on that network will still have the same needs met?
So is this working now? No, I don't know what that one is. Hello? Hello?
No. Thank you so much, Congressman Huffman and your staff, for giving us this opportunity to come and sort of talk about the issues that are facing us in rural parts of the country regarding this telephone transition. So I come from Kentucky, and about 4 years ago, a bill suddenly surfaced in our legislature that quickly became known as the AT&T bill. And it was a bill to deregulate AT&T, Windstream, and Cincinnati Bell, which had been somewhat deregulated in 2006, but this was kind of a complete deregulation. A group of consumer advocates, including the Kentucky AARP, an organization called Kentucky Resources Council, a statewide citizens group, unions, and some of the small telecommunications providers kind of organized around this, and we felt this was really premature to have happen in Kentucky. And we were successful for 3 years in sort of staving off this legislation, and it over those 3 years it became modified slightly so that it was somewhat better. But sadly this year our legislators succumbed to the industry claims that Kentucky would not see telecommunications modernization or increased high-speed internet build-out unless these corporations were released from Kentucky Public Service Commission oversight and universal service obligations. So the bill did pass. It will go into effect July 1st, and it'll immediately affect towns with over 15,000 people. Those seeking, it originally was written it was going to affect every area of Kentucky, so this is a bit of a positive change. But those seeking new service in rural areas can be denied basic standalone landline service and either take something else or no service at all. And in Kentucky, landlines are really our lifeline. The state ranks 46 in access to broadband. Only 23% of rural Kentuckians have access at high-speed internet, and that's probably about zero at the new high-speed rate that's much higher. When broadband is available, there's often only one provider, at most two. We're also a poor state, so when people have access to broadband and don't adopt it, the reason they most often state is the price. They just can't afford it. So lifelines are really critical. Some of the things I'll just mention when we were in this campaign, one Eastern Kentucky woman told us her story. She moved to a house that was about 3 miles from the county seat, which is a town with 3,000 people and a community college. But she found in her new home there was no DSL service, and the cable line ended a half mile from her new house. Her cell phone didn't work there, and to get broadband service, the cable company said she could pay $10,000 to get the cable run to her home, Her other alternative was satellite internet, which was very slow and prohibitively expensive. So her landline was her only means of communicating. Another woman from Stamping Ground in central Kentucky wrote that this might not hurt customers who want premium services or have access to competitors, but it will hurt those who live in rural places where the phone company has a monopoly. On our county road, there's no home cell phone reception, cable, or DSL, no competition. We, customers of Bell South, now AT&T, have paid for this line over years and decades. Our rates increased by $3 in January with no notice and without explanation. If the bill passes, AT&T could quit offering a low-cost basic plan or simply quit serving us altogether. So those are some of the issues, and other folks are going to speak the issue of 911 service and medical alerts, and all those things are very big in Kentucky as well. The industry, that industry says medical alerts possibly aren't going to work at all. I think others are going to speak to some of that.
So, I can probably just speak from here. Thanks, Mimi and Jodianne. We're going to hold questions until all the panelists have spoken, so please write them down and keep them in your mind. Okay, so next we'll hear from Randy McDonald. Do you want to?
Yes. Please direct your attention to the screen. While I go over here to operate high-tech capital technology, I promise you a good show.
So Randy will talk to us about network resiliency. So one of the challenges in this technology transition is that, as Mimi mentioned, not every new technology is compatible with 911 location. Maybe it requires additional backup power that consumers have not been accustomed to obtain, like batteries or electric generator for when your power goes out so that your phone continues to work. And that also it might not be able to connect with additional devices like heart monitors, life alert, ATM machines that businesses use. So Randy will talk to us about network resiliency. He is second assistant fire chief for the Comchi Volunteer Fire Department, and is a public safety liaison for the Broadband Alliance of Mendocino County in rural California. So go ahead, Randy.
Thank you. Again, direct your attention to the screen. As we consider network resiliency, I'm going to focus on the most important service our telephone network supports, America's 911 system. This is our emergency lifeline because you, me, and citizens across the country depend on this system to summon help in an emergency. Since it was established in 1968, America's 911 system has saved countless lives and has improved victim outcomes significantly. It is truly a model for the world, and we've been improving it with new capabilities such as Enhanced 911, which identifies reporting parties' physical location. That's the good news. The bad news is that our excellent 911 system is now being eroded, and this erosion is especially evident in rural America. There are four major factors eroding our 911 system. Every day, the percentage of 911 callers whose location can be identified is declining as people move to new telephone technologies such as voice over IP, cell phones, and internet phones. As early as 1995, the National Institute of Standards and Technology warned that the power of optical fiber technology is diminishing the number of geographic transmission routes, resulting in an increase in network vulnerability. Telephone companies are moving away from the copper-based phone system as fast as they can. They're going wireless and using fiber because it's much more profitable. These companies have little incentive to maintain their copper lines, even though they're still relied upon by many Americans. And new technologies like fiber, wireless, and VoIP do not carry power like copper does. How will citizens reach 911 during a power outage? What will happen to people who depend on medical alert devices? As we consider the erosion of our 911 system, especially in rural America, we must ask ourselves, is this what we want from United States policy? To let our excellent 911 system be degraded, leaving more and more people at risk? No member of Congress would ever publicly take a position supporting this change. But this is what's happening now to America's 911 system. Let me tell you what happened to me. On August 3rd last year, a fiber optic cable break west of my town caused telecom service to go down across a 40-mile section of the northern Mendocino County coast. 20% of county residents were cut off for 45 hours. 911 and reverse 911 were unavailable. The outage impacted operations of a major wildland fire and harmed the economies of 8 coastal communities. Ironically, AT&T had a second fiber line running up the coast, but they had not linked that line to the one that broke. Looking at network topology, we can see why our networks are becoming less resilient, especially in rural America. Traditional phone service is delivered through central offices that are linked together to ensure that people stay connected even when a line breaks. Telcos are now moving to much simpler networks, which are less expensive for them, but not as resilient. As I was preparing this briefing, I did a simple search on Google for fiber outages that impacted 911 systems and easily found a dozen examples. Winter 2006, Humboldt County, California. August 5th, 2008, Highland, Illinois. January 26, 2010, 2 counties in Minnesota. Multiple counties in Pennsylvania in June 3rd, 2013. May 10th, Sonoma County, California, May 10th, 2013. November 2013, San Juan Islands, Washington State. August 3rd, 2014, Mendocino, California. Oh, I'm jumping around, aren't I? Let's get to Mendocino. Where's my little hometown? Anyway, multiple Wisconsin counties in December 18, 2014. December 19, northern Arizona. February 11th, 2015, West Hawaii Island. Northern New Mexico, March 27, 2015. And multiple counties in Iowa, April 24, 2015. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. According to the FCC, the number of high-capacity fiber optic outages more than doubled from 221 in 2010 to 487 in 2014. When these outages impacted rural America, the lack of redundancy cut off access to the 911 system in some of those areas. The question for policymakers is what to do about this. I ask you to keep 3 principles in mind as you consider telecom policy. 1, make public safety the top priority. There is no higher priority than to ensure the safety of the public. We must not retreat from the progress we have made. We must not compromise our vital 911 system. As you consider telecom policy, put public safety first. Address network vulnerability. We know that networks in rural America are becoming more vulnerable. In addition to requiring network redundancy and proper maintenance of legacy networks, policymakers must also ensure that new technologies can be managed to reduce network vulnerability. And finally, let's keep our citizens informed. The public needs to know what is happening to our telecommunications system. Many citizens have no idea that the phone they've used for decades is no longer as reliable as it was in the past. They purchase new types of telecom services without knowing that doing so has made them more vulnerable in an emergency. And agencies like mine, which protect the public, need to know where networks are not redundant, so we have the information we need to ensure public safety. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. We're going to do a little shuffle here. Oh, there we go. So next we're going to hear from Regina Costa, who will talk to us about rural call completion. And she is the telecommunications director at TURN, the Utility Reform Network in Northern California, where she is responsible for regulatory, economic, and public policy of telecom issues. She also serves on the Telecommunications Committee of the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates, NASUCA. And Regina will tell us about the challenges we have seen in completing calls to and from rural areas with internet protocol networks and what policymakers can do to make sure that those calls go completed.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
It'd be better if the mic was on. I'm going to address 3 quick points. What is rural call completion? What is the problem? How do the current technology transitions exacerbate the problem? And what can you as policymakers do to address it? Simply put, rural call completion issues occur when someone calls a customer making a long distance call, and instead of hearing that person pick up the phone, they might hear nothing, dead air. They might get a busy signal. They might hear endless ringing, or they receive a recorded message saying that line is not in service when they know darn well that the phone line is in service. The problem is also associated with very poor call quality. You might hear extremely choppy sounds or echoes or staccato voices on the other end. Fax machines fail to sometimes successfully complete long distance calls. And this affects everyone. Residential customers, businesses, it impacts the economy, but it also impacts public safety. There were cases in Iowa where hospitals could not receive phone calls from associated medical clinics. Long distance faxes of medical records did not go through. So it's a very significant problem for society, for the economy, and for public safety. Then the next question is, well, how do the current tech transitions affect this? The problems occur when a customer of company A makes a long distance call to a customer of company B. But it's not just those two networks involved. A simple long distance call within one of your states can travel over as many as 4 or 5 what are called intermediate networks. Long distance networks that are located between those two local telephone companies. The local telephone companies contract with other carriers to carry the calls. In any given state, you can have over 100 companies competing for the business to carry long distance telephone calls. And you can make a telephone call, you're located, say, in the state of Minnesota or the state of Iowa, you're calling someone within that state, that call can be routed through one of thousands of carriers that operate nationally. Begins and ends in your state, but there are multiple parties involved in this. A telephone company can contract with a company to carry calls. That company can bring in a subcontractor. And then that company brings in another subcontractor. And while this is happening, they are competing for the business of carrying this traffic, and that's when most of the rural call completion problems occur. These networks are not always compatible, and VoIP exacerbates the situation because carriers engage in something called least cost routing, and they have done it for a long time. But VoIP, and what that is they program their network to search out the least costly way of routing that call, and that's a good thing. But when VoIP enters the picture, it gets more complicated. Sometimes these networks are not compatible. And if they're not compatible, then you see these problems. So the next question is, well, what can policymakers do? I think first and foremost, there needs to be a recognition that this is a joint federal-state issue. Because for the example described earlier, the calls travel outside of a state to get back into the state. Data collection is extremely important. The FCC has taken some steps to get better information on the problems that are occurring, but more steps need to be taken, and those issues are on the table in front of the FCC. There needs to be clear authority. Right now, the authority over addressing this problem is very unclear. Now, the FCC has a notice of proposed rulemaking, and some states have had complaint actions or investigations. But there are instances where carriers will insist that the state does not have the ability to get the information necessary to address the problem because they are VoIP carriers or IP carriers, so therefore the state can't touch them. Well, that's cold comfort to a customer who cannot receive their calls. The states need to have the ability to do this, and that needs to be clear. And the best approach to that is truthfully is Title II. That provides the most clear, efficient framework to tackle the problem. We also believe that S827 is a very good start to addressing these issues. First and foremost, it would create a registry of all of the companies involved in providing these immediate traffic carrying functions. That's necessary in order to be able to pinpoint these problems. For future issues, it's going to be very important for the FCC to work with states and work with ADIS, which is a standard-setting body, to develop the criteria that should be applied to these companies. There needs to be certain specific information that's tracked, that's available to the FCC and state commissions so that they can investigate, identify, and fix the problems. And more to the point, so that the carriers themselves have the information and the standards and the monitoring necessary to stop the problems before they start. Thank you.
Thank you, Regina. Next we'll hear from Whitney Kimball-Coe, who is the coordinator of the National Rural Assembly. And we're going to just do a little shuffle here because we are using chairs. Whitney will talk to us about consumer education during and after the technology transition. So you've been hearing a lot about the technical problems, the challenges that we're facing with completing calls, with 911 connectivity, with just the availability of the service. So now we want to know what the consumers know. The National Rural Assembly is guided by the principle that an inclusive, prospering, and sustainable rural America improves prospects for us all. And access to communication services is a crucial component of our work to ensure that all Americans are part of our society. So with that, Whitney will tell us about what they've heard at the Rural Assembly for consumers in terms of technology transitions and the work that they have done to educate policymakers to reach out to consumers.
Thanks, Adele. Thank you all for being here. My name is Whitney Kimball Coe, and I am the coordinator of the National Rural Assembly, which has been around since about 2007. And it's a coalition, a growing coalition of rural leaders and advocates and policymakers. Some of you may have even attended an assembly gathering. So we've been around for about 7 or 8 years, and we've got another assembly coming up here in September 2015. So we've gathered leaders from across the country, across geographies, across sectors to talk about issues that matter to rural communities and to figure out how to build a common agenda that will address those issues and will ultimately help the nation as a whole. When we first met in 2007, we were all about healthcare, natural resources, investment, and education as sort of like the 4 pillars, but we realized very quickly that access to any of those things didn't matter if we didn't have access to communication tools, to the most modern communication tools like broadband. And as you just heard Adele say in her introduction, out of the 55 million people who don't have broadband service, over half of those are rural people, and over a third of those are in tribal nations. So we're really behind the game. There's this big digital divide, and I know you've heard of that. And I feel like one of the conversations that needs to be had is why that matters. Why does that even matter? I mean, people choose, if they're living in rural, don't they choose to live that way, without that, need for access? But there is a great need, especially when it comes to providing services, achieving jobs, creating new ideas and innovations that can be shared broadly. And plus, it's an existential question. As a philosophy major, I'm really interested in those. Why are we here? We're here to connect. And rural Americans are no different from the rest of us. We need to connect. So there's this big digital divide, and now we're moving on to tech transitions, which nobody knows about. Nobody understands. We did this survey with the Rural Broadband Policy Group a couple of months ago where we asked our rural leaders what's going on with tech transitions in your neck of the woods, and most of them, 75% of them came back with, we don't know what kind of technology the phone companies are using. We know that we need our landlines, but we don't know if a call is dropped. We don't necessarily know that it's about the phone network, or if we can't reach 911, we may not understand that it has to do with broadband or the connection, the phone connection there. So there's an urgent need to number one, bridge this digital divide, and then number 2, educate consumers about the tech transition. So there are a couple of really great opportunities through the Rural Assembly to do that, because we're this wonderful network that spans the whole country and all these geographies and cultures and communities. You can penetrate to those folks through the National Rural Assembly if you so choose. In September, we'll have this national gathering, which is going to be 200 of those leaders. We'll include the White House Rural Council, the FCC. Hopefully we'll hear more about the FCC Rural Tour that's happening right now as we speak, and hopefully the FCC is hearing this bit about the digital divide as they go to rural communities. But the National Rural Assembly is a great place to really hear back from rural constituents and about what we need in terms of consumer education. And then likewise, I think FCC is the great existential agency of our time. It is preserving and safeguarding, our need for connection and our ability to connect. So in your communications with FCC and other policy groups, I think that's a primary topic of concern is rural consumer education.
Thank you, Vicky.
5 minutes.
Thank you. So finally, another component, and our final component of this panel is that if we are talking about transitioning on to broadband service as the quintessential necessity service that we all will need in order to participate in society, then a main component of that conversation, at least for rural and low-income Americans, is affordability. Right? How do you make the service affordable? And so our last speaker, Cheryl Harmon, who is a tremendous young advocate from Elkins, West Virginia, will talk to us about the importance of affordable broadband. for Roy.
It's okay, I'm loud. I have 3 kids, so I have to
There's
be
a
loud.
mic on your side, if you, on that side. Like
It's okay. You guys can hear me, right?
And so let me tell you a little bit about Cheryl. So Cheryl was recently elected to the National Council of Young Leaders for Youth Build USA. She was proudly representing the Rural Caucus within that organization, and she visited the Federal Communications Commission to share with the officials there about her experience as a Lifeline phone recipient, and also to share with them a set of recommendations on Lifeline modernization that she and her peers created for the Lifeline program.
Thank you all for being here. Once again, my name is Sherelle Harmon, and I'm here representing Youth Build from North Central West Virginia, also the Young Leaders Council for Youth Build USA. And I'm here to on more of a personal level, but I want to explain to you a little bit more of what Youth Build is. I don't know if you've heard of it. But it's a program for low-income youth. It helps guide them to their GEDs, their diplomas, college education, but finishing. And also by providing workforce training and getting you some hours and preparing you for also your professional life. So how did I, find out about Youth Build? How did I get to Youth Build? And Lifeline played a big part in it. When I lost everything and I had to start from the beginning, I had to apply for Lifeline. It's something that, we all, we don't want to apply for anything. We don't want to have to depend on assistance, but sometimes it happens. And I had to apply for Lifeline, and I've been connected since. And I haven't missed anything. I've been able to make my way to West Virginia. I've been able to put in applications, keep in touch with my FAFSA. I'm in college, so Lifeline helped me get to West Virginia and transition me into furthering, what I'm trying to do for my kids and just anything in general for them and myself. But one of the things I want to talk to you about, how did I come across Lifeline? I was lagging on my cell phone bill, and communication is one of the first things that have to go. You need your electricity, you need your water. So one of the first things that has to go is, your telephone, or your internet, or your cable, but your communication. So like I said, I applied for it, and ever since I've been connected, whether it's school, whether it's my doctor's appointments, my kids' well visits, my well visits, my FAFSA, anything, that's how I stay connected. And so I'm an advocate for young people, for rural young people, for low-income rural young people. So, like I said, it's more personal for me, and my fellow students that I go to school with. They come to school every day and they complain that once they go home, they don't have internet. They don't have any access to anything. They can't do their homework. They can't study. They can't do anything. The only time they have to communicate or stay connected is when they're at school. And, it was interesting to me that when we did do our spreadsheet at the Rural Caucus that 13 of 21 of the students there only had access at home. And to me, that's, tremendous because, that's all those kids that, what do they do with their time? They're not working on their educational things. They're not putting applications. They're not doing anything productive because they're not connected. So, it's getting an existence in rural areas, but also affordable. Because even if it's there, is it affordable? Because I pay my internet bill, but like I said, it's the one thing that lags. If I can't get to it, it's gone. Because we need our electricity, we need our water. So, it needs to be existing, but it also has to be affordable. So that's one thing that, I came here to, deliver to you guys. And I wanted to go over a couple things that I went over with my fellow students at the Rural Caucus to kind of structurize the Lifeline broadband internet, because we're hoping it will exist one day. And one thing we came up with was the recipient must have a choice. You know what I mean? Not just more so given to them, but have a choice. How much data can I use? Where can I use it? How do I? Just some type of input on how to get it started, and then prevent wired and wireless data caps. Don't cut me off. Because data, you need it. And you need so much of it. Like I said. Applications, anything, you need all your data. You can't cap it. Don't cap it too much, put a limit on it, because that's something that happens when you're getting assistance. They have caps on things. So we just wanted to, make sure that it's enough, for anybody that will receive this assistance. Fund digital literacy, just because you're giving me free internet does not mean I can afford the technology for it. Computers are expensive. We do have people out there who cannot afford these things. So just like the Lifeline phone, they provide you with a free phone. They put minutes in it for you. And we just felt like it should be similar to the Lifeline phone. You know, provide some type of tablet, laptop, you know, doesn't have to be top of the line, you know, anything, but just similar to the Lifeline phone. Provide me the material and then the internet. So that's just a couple things that we went over. We knew it needed structure. So we sat down. We could have went all day. We were debating about it, but so that's just it. We want it to exist and also be affordable for our young people so we can advance. So thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. So it was quite a treat to witness and to see Cheryl's Rural Youth Caucus really come up with recommendations that we'll have available as well. There's a handout outside, and we will post all of the comments that the speakers made today on our website, and we'll share it with all of you. I think you should have signed in if you didn't RSVP, so you'll get materials from us, and we'll visit your offices too. But now I want to thank the participants for taking time to come out from their communities, flying probably a whole day to get to here and chat with you guys. So thank you very much, and we'll take questions. So if you guys have any questions prepared, please go ahead. Don't be shy. I know you got questions. Sure.
Yeah, from the Mexican's office. I have a quick question for you about rural call completion. Is there a way of quantifying that, where the problems are happening, who's making the calls, how many are being dropped, or is it more of an existential?
It's a combination. It really depends on where you are. The FCC is making an effort to establish processes and procedures so that they can track this information more comprehensively. And it really depends on the state that you're in. There are some states who don't have authority at all to touch this stuff. There are other states like Iowa, which has dealt with the issue through pursuing complaint cases. And in those dockets, they have unearthed a lot of, very empirical information about the issues, the extent of the problems, and the carriers involved. And that is really what the effort is about, to try to get at the federal level standardized reporting. There are FCC requirements for reporting, but there's a problem with them in that they keep the data sort of short term, and states aren't automatically notified that there is information on the situation in their state. And if they don't know to ask for it in a timely fashion, it disappears. It's not required to be kept. So there have to be requirements on data reporting. It is possible to quantify this and to gather empirical data. There are proposals on the table for doing that. They haven't been fully enacted at this point. But this is a thing that crosses party lines. It shouldn't matter where you are in this country. You've got to be able to complete your calls. And so if a carrier is involved in that process, the reason for the need to set the standards and to set the reporting criteria is so that when there is a problem, you can identify the source of the problem and fix it.
Other questions? Yes, Liz?
Well, I just wanted to say hi, Sherelle.
Hi.
I actually grew up in Philippi.
Oh, nice. Right down from Elkins.
Yeah, I work for Senator Capito.
Oh, nice.
Senate side, so we're happy to see you here.
Yeah.
My question is actually for Whitney. I know you're from Kentucky. I guess if you could just talk a little bit more about your education programs. A lot of our carriers in our state tell us that our problem is that we have a low take rate, and they tell us, work on educating your consumers. Can you, just expand a little bit on some of the programs you do?
Mm-hmm. I'm not from Kentucky, actually. My accent sounds a little bit like I'm from Tennessee. And I have more of a national perspective on consumer education, but I don't know if you want to answer that specifically from a Kentucky standpoint, the kind of education that is, Mimi is from Kentucky.
I don't think there's a lot. I know in Kentucky there has been a state office of broadband, and they have done a number of efforts to increase adoption. It is a big rate. I know one thing they did is they were providing computers in some of the community action agencies. And when folks were coming in there to do the winter weatherization program, they could actually get information and get some access and those kinds of things. And then libraries have been really important in our region. You know, I think Eastern Kentucky is similar to West Virginia, and the cost is really a big issue. And we just, you know, the same Kentucky office did do a survey of people that in rural areas where there was broadband available and yet they weren't adopting it, and it was cost was number one. Number two, we don't need it, you know, which some of the older people say that. But, you know, it is a real effort to educate, and we can, once those grandparents see that the grandbabies are on Facebook, that's an incentive to do GED classes, to get on the internet, those kinds of things. But it is an issue, I think.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about maintenance of legacy infrastructure, and that's kind of, in Mendocino, that was a big issue, you know, the recent outage that happened in my lawsuit district last winter led to, you know, nearly 45 days of no service for certain homes, and I'm kind of curious if you can talk about, we tried to pressure AT&T, but there wasn't much of a federal nexus there, so how do we kind of continue to support, you know, greater deployment of broadband and other services while making sure that those kind of legacy infrastructures aren't being left behind?
First, a real fundamental point. Copper is not obsolete, ladies and gentlemen. It's a very valuable technology that a lot of competitive carriers use to provide broadband. And for rural areas of the United States, fiber, in a lot of cases, is just not an option. You may have a big fiber backbone carrying a lot of traffic, but to get it to the home, it's very expensive. And wireless is oftentimes not an option. I mean, in our neck of the woods, I live kind of near Randy in Congressman Huffman's district. We have a lot of trees, we have a lot of mountains, and there are many places where technically somebody may say there's wireless service here, but there is not wireless service for many, many people, so it just doesn't work. Whereas for a lot of communities in the United States, the copper network has been out there for a long time, and it has provided reliable service. The two major carriers in the U.S., Verizon and AT&T, have stated objectives to get out of the copper landline business. AT&T has a goal of eliminating 25% of its landlines by the year 2020. Verizon has said in many shareholder briefings that it does not intend to maintain its copper, and it wants to move customers off of that wireline network and either onto a fixed wireless service called VoiceLink or onto their fiber network. Now, Verizon has not deployed fiber in even all of its major metropolitan areas, and where it is not now, it will not be in the future. AT&T UVerse uses copper to a point, but there are many communities that do not have that service. And so, you know, the FCC has really stepped up to the plate on this issue. Public knowledge, my group TURN, several NASUCA offices filed a joint letter to the FCC attaching over 250 pages of evidence compiled and sent to various states about the deliberate decisions to not maintain the copper, to literally let those facilities rot, and then use that as an excuse or an opportunity when a customer calls up to get their service fixed. They say, my line's not working, can you please repair it? They say, well, we're going to move you to something better. And they try to move them to fiber if it's there, or they try to move them to a wireless service, or they try to convince them that all they really need is a cell phone, and we're putting up a new tower and we'll give you an antenna to make it all work better. There are problems with that approach in that the new stuff requires backup batteries. If you're in a canyon and you have a 30-hour power outage, that wireless antenna from AT&T is not going to help you. Now, the FCC has really stepped up to the plate on this in response to our letter. They recently solicited comments in their tech transition docket addressing what they call de facto retirement. There is a process for copper retirement. And that process is they have to notify competitive carriers that we don't want to maintain copper anymore in this area. The FCC has to grant approval. There's another process which was mentioned by Jody called Section 214, which is if a company wishes to discontinue its service, its wireline service, it has to go through the 214 process. What the FCC has said is those are not sufficient anymore because the the decisions to withdraw service have gone beyond what those rules were intended to govern. We're not talking about moving out a few lines anymore. We're talking about discontinuing the service's entire communities. And one of the issues addressed in that notice was that it's not, de facto retirement is not appropriate, that the maintenance is required on these networks, and that they wanted public comment on what should be done. Well, some of the public comment, there's a role for both the FCC and states in this. It gets complicated because some states have deregulated. And so the state commission might not have the authority. So it's imperative that in those situations, the FCC has the authority to step in and say, in a place like, say, Kentucky or Florida or Alabama, where there is no oversight, this is not appropriate. You need to fix your network. You haven't been authorized to withdraw this service, and there are consequences, and one of them is thou shalt repair thy network now and give these customers service. State commissions also have authority over service quality rulemakings. We've seen it in Delaware, District of Columbia, Maryland, California has a docket. So it's important for states to step up to the plate. And what can be done from a congressional level, I think, is to interact with those agencies and stress to them the importance of requiring that these networks be maintained. I think the authority to do that is there in the Communications Act of 1934. Affordable, reliable service to all of the people of the United States, regardless of the technology. If you guys ever rewrite the law, please leave that part in. Because it really doesn't matter, what kind of technology it is. It's got to work. I think the authority's there, but it's a matter of the states and the FCC stepping up to the plate. I think the FCC is stepping up to the plate. And that's one encouraging thing.
Yeah, I mean, Regina covered that very well. I guess just to clarify, so in the FCC docket right now, they've got the service discontinuance piece, which is about what service you're offering to consumers. And then there's the copper retirement piece, which is looking at the physical infrastructure. Because you could switch copper to fiber and still keep what we call TDM, so not move to IP. You could switch both as you move. But there are two tracks that may run together depending on what kind of transition the carrier wants to do. Or you could just be looking at copper retirement, which for the FCC is handled under Section 251. And that's about giving notice to competitive carriers that are using that network, and giving them time to think about how that's going to impact the contracts. And a lot of businesses use competitive carriers, so it's a big impact for businesses. And the FCC is now saying, well, we should also let consumers know what's going on, because even if you're not changing the protocols that you're using for the carrier, just changing the physical infrastructure can impact consumers if it's battery backup or a heart monitor that's not going to be supported by the new physical infrastructure, or something, security alarm, something like that. And we need to let consumers know too. And then they also look at de facto retirement for when a carrier has not filed anything under the copper retirement rules, and yet the FCC starts seeing complaints saying, well, they said they're not going to repair it, which is basically retiring it. And so the FCC, I think, rightly said, we're going to look at that too.
I think the key thing is the authority is there for regulatory commissions to act. They have to have support from their representatives, whether it's at the state level or the federal level. Just a couple of examples. Big rainstorms in LA a few years ago knocked out phone service for an extended period of time to 250,000 people in one of the largest metropolitan areas of the country. Now, that shouldn't happen. 4 years prior to that, there were big rainstorms. Similar amount of water, similar duration, the phone lines stayed perfect. And that is a clear sign of network deterioration. Randy's neck of the woods. Even more recent than the fiber cut, AT&T declared a state of emergency for the entire state of California. What that means is under a state of emergency, you don't have to report outages. They're free and clear. They don't have to report them. So there's no record of what happened. However, in his district, people tend to be a little bit vociferous about things, And they report things to each other and to my group and to the California Public Utilities Commission and the Congressman and every other elected representative, because some of them do have email. And what happened was there were businesses out of commission for months, okay? Residences could not call for months. The Anderson Valley Wine Growers Association could not communicate. But more to the point, public safety. If your line's out, you can't call 911, and when you're in a rural area, particularly one where there are storms, there are narrow roads, some of which are paved, you've got to be able to reach these people during an emergency. AT&T felt the heat, and so they brought in a lot of people from out of state to repair these lines. Oh, no, we don't have a problem. The reality is these companies don't have enough staff people. They don't have enough experienced technicians. They're offshoring a lot of their work, and they just decided they just don't feel like maintaining the network. And the other part, too, of reality is there is the authority to make them do that, and it's about time for states to step up to the plate and follow the FCC's lead.
Here.
Other questions? Thank you. And I do want to jump on that end of 911 and being able to have backup power. I think that's one of the things that I personally really care about. I'm from South Texas, the Rio Grande Valley, which is right on the Gulf Coast. So if anybody here is from a coastal area, no? There you go. So my coastal area friends. The transition to new technologies presents opportunities to increase, broadband services, communication services. It also brings in some vulnerabilities, as we've been talking about. Primarily for coastal areas that are prone to hurricanes. If you have a new network that does not power itself, like copper does, then that means that consumers are now responsible for powering their phone when the electricity goes out. So I'll give you an example. In 2008, back in Texas, we had a hurricane. It was Hurricane Dolly. And it was a small hurricane, as hurricanes go. It was only a Category 3, so it wasn't we didn't have to evacuate. We weren't on notice of that alert. But the power did go out at my parents' house, which is Elsa, Texas. It went out for 3 days. I lived in Edinburgh, Texas, which is about 20 miles away. So we all crammed up in my 1-bedroom apartment, 6 family members of us. It was a joyous 3 days while my parents received their power back. Thankfully, at the time, the copper still worked, so they were able to call me and say, hey, can we come over? And they were able to leave their house. But there were communities in between Elsa and Edinburgh, namely really rural and low-income communities known as colonias, which are unincorporated areas of town that don't have infrastructure, that span all of the Southwest, that were under 6 feet of water for weeks. So people there had to evacuate. They had to leave and figure out what they were going to do. Now you might think, well, if you're under 6 feet of water, you probably don't need your telephone. Yeah, at the time that your house is underwater, you don't need your telephone because your house is underwater. But at the time when you're able to come back, you need those communications networks and that infrastructure to be in place for you to ready to get back to your life. So it's not something that, the backup power and the ability for a communications for your telephone to work during the hurricane. Not only do you need it during the time of greatest need, when you want to receive the alert of, hey, now your entire town is going to evacuate because you want to be safe. You need it before so that you know that you have your telephone and you can get your networks, your notifications. You need it during the hurricane, and then you need it after, because in order to rebuild, you need to have reliable communications networks to get your business back on feet, to get all the information that you'll need to get your kids in school, to even be able to get FEMA funding to be able to fix your house once a hurricane is gone. So I really invite you guys to think about the reliability of network and how backup power will be a huge problem, a huge challenge in rural communities and poor communities that are going to be impacted by hurricanes. Because once the power goes out at your house, your TV's out, your cable's out, your internet's out. So even when companies say, well, we'll give you internet service, well, the internet is going to go out if you don't have backup power. Then if your telephone goes out, you're really out left on your own to figure out how to be safe. So that's a big concern for coastal communities that are experiencing these types of transitions. Other questions?
Yes, you mentioned that, the phone is there, but how many consumers really have plug-in phones in the wall? I mean, a lot of them just have cordless phones, even if they use the regular phone system, the old copper system. So how do you encourage that?
So actually consumers know that their cordless phone is not going to work. So for example, when you get like, oh, hurricane is coming, bring up my safety list, you're going to go get sandbags from the city town hall, right? Because they give out sandbags to block out your, you need to put tape on your windows. You need to get batteries for your light, for your lantern, what's it called? Flashlight, for your lantern. Oil for your lantern. You need bread and water and canned food and all of those things. But you don't know that, so you do know that you need a plug-in phone, and you have it. It's like stored in the house because you know that your cordless phone is going to go out. But now you don't know that the telephone company, is not bringing a network that powers itself. So that's the challenge, and that's one of the concerns that we have with consumer education. People know they need a telephone that plugs into their house, but the network itself also needs to be able to power itself in order for consumers to know what they need to know. And if there's a network that does not power itself, like a fiber or a wireless network, right, that is like, well, at the central location, we won't bring out power to your house, then consumers need to know that. Because if the carrier is not going to provide backup power, then the consumer has to figure out how to provide it for themselves. And we did a calculation, actually. Was it Verizon that we looked into? Yeah. Verizon Voice Link. So if a consumer is responsible for 1 week, it was Verizon. So if a consumer is responsible for 1 week of backup power, right, which the state of Texas, because of hurricane land, recommends having 3 weeks of power backup for long outages. I mean, they have short outages and long outages, which hurricanes usually cause. They say, the state of Texas Public Safety Department says 3 weeks of battery backup power or backup energy power is what you want during a hurricane. So we did a calculation of if you have Verizon wireless home phone service and you want backup power for 1 week, just 1 week, not the 3, it will cost you around $800. So we're actually witnessing a cultural shift for consumers, right? Who know they gotta get the water, they gotta get the sandbags, they gotta get the batteries for their flashlight, they gotta get the bread, they gotta get all of that. But they don't know that they might now have to come up with $800 for 1 week of battery backup. And that's just for one incident. I mean, we might continue to have several hurricanes during 1 year, right? And so that might be more doable for some consumers, but for low-income consumers in rural areas, I mean, that's not going to be met. That's rent for 2 months.
And they also don't know that in moving to these new services, they're being convinced to do that 911 might not be reliable. I mean, my parents, who are in their late 80s, moved to a VoIP. They had no idea, that had never given it any thought that could happen, or thought about the whole implications of losing power. So there's got to be some consumer education along with these new technologies.
And I just want to remind us all that we purchase these services. Someone came up with this term, and not to be pejorative at all, that we're consumers. And yeah, we buy things. We're citizens. We're people, And too often we allow economic principles of people that are benefiting from the exclusive use of the public right away to compromise their public safety. And unless someone stands up, and this is the place where people are sent to do so, and insists on the public's right to be protected and the public's right to be informed, then the public's government is selling them out.
And I think another point here is that, if you took a confidential straw poll, the people who would be most worried about the backup power issue in telecommunications are the folks who day-to-day spend their lives working on homeland security and public safety. Because if you look at the evolution of the power grid and the vulnerabilities associated with that, if your power grid goes out, and most of the people in this country are relying on communication services that need that power grid to function, you have not only lost your power, but you've lost the ability of anybody to contact anybody that needs to be contacted in those situations. The first responders can't be reached. Okay, all of these guys get called to go out on a fire or an incident. I live in a similar unincorporated area where it's all volunteer fire departments. They need to be notified. There's a problem here, you need to report in. The hospitals need to be put on alert. When that line got cut in Mendocino County, everything got cut. The hospital could not get any information. They could not contact their doctors, their nurses, anybody. There was a wildland fire going north of that line. Reverse 911 did not work. People were being told, sign up for reverse 911. Well, guess what, kids? It didn't work. Well, if you have a national or a widespread regional emergency and your power's out, and there's not adequate backup power for your communication systems, that exacerbates that problem immensely. It really is a matter of public safety.
Yeah, so, and I know we're now getting a little far afield from your question, but just to build on the point about, this is the public, not just, consumers, as we usually describe it. This network that we have now, it was not a happy accident. It was not a gift from the phone companies. This was the result of more than 100 years of policy at the federal and state and local levels. We all supported the network. We subsidized it through intercarrier compensation, through direct subsidies of different USF programs. We gave public rights of way. We gave pole attachment rights. We supported this network in so many ways, and it is the public who helped create it through federal policies, through state policies. And that is part of why I look at the transition now and I say, these carriers, they knew what the world was like when they entered it. And I don't think they will be surprised when the public says, no, we gave input on this system, we helped build it, and it's so important to public safety, it's so important to national security, and the information infrastructure in our country that you can't just walk away from it. We have to have a plan when we want to transition.
That's really great to summarize it. So we've actually we went over time. We were really thankful for all of you to sticking around till the end. We have handouts for all of the speeches that were provided today, and we'll post them online, so we'll share it with you via email and social media. But thank you so much. Please join me in clapping for our Feel free to stay in touch with us as we talk about technology transitions, both at the FCC, at the federal and the state level. We really need you to encourage your bosses to stay engaged in this conversation, to learn about it, and to speak out. So thank you so much for joining us, and take some pastries before they take them away. Thank you.